Welcome, everyone. I'm Maury Nailward, the Executive Director of Town Green, and we are pleased to present this webinar this evening called Personal Sustainability and Action, Addressing Climate Grief and Anxiety. Tonight's webinar with Dr. Thomas Doherty will provide participants with learning new ways to cope, adapt, and take action on ecological and climate issues through assessing their environmental identity, values, and experiences, adapting their existing worldviews and diverse skill sets in relationship to address local and global environmental issues, and applying these in real and meaningful efforts in their personal and professional lives. I'm pleased to have Dr. Thomas Doherty with us this evening. Dr. Doherty is a psychologist based in Portland, Oregon, who has a specialty in addressing people's concerns about environmental issues and climate change. His publications include the groundbreaking paper, The Psychological Impacts of Global Climate Change, cited over 1,000 times. Doherty is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and founded one of its first environmentally focused training programs for mental health counselors in the US at Lewis and Clark Graduate School in Portland. He is originally from Buffalo, New York. Dr. Doherty's work has been featured in publications like the New York Times. He's also co-hosts the Climate Change and Happiness podcast, and that's available on Spotify and other podcast platforms. You can learn more about Dr. Doherty's work and his trainings for mental health professionals at his website, selfsustain.com. Welcome, Dr. Doherty. We're so pleased to have you.
Thanks, Maureen and Tom, and thanks all of you for having me. I'm coming in from Portland, Oregon, so the Portland on the West Coast, and yeah, I have got a lot of good personal and family connections in New England. I went to graduate school in New Hampshire, and I've got family in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Maine. So I really have a soft spot for the coast in New England. So it's good to speak with you all. I'm going to share my screen. We'll make sure that's still working fine. And Maureen, you'll let me know if there's any tech issues. Um, yeah, so I'm going to talk about a kind of a range of ideas and concepts and practices around what I call personal sustainability. And that's simply bringing all of your sustainability values and principles to play in your own life. So not only extending it outward to the world, but bringing it inward to yourself. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Um, I've got a couple of opening metaphors. I'm working on a manuscript right now about coping with climate change and these big global issues, and I've been playing around with some different ideas. And I'm going to put out some metaphors that we can maybe come back to later that help to sort of give us a big enough palette to think about things we might talk about. One metaphor that I like to use is the pond metaphor, and this is something you'd be familiar. Ponds are something you'd be familiar with in Massachusetts and New England. Walden Pond, for example, which is that picture on the left. Um, I like the pond metaphor when we're talking about environmental issues, things like climate change, because they have both a surface and a depth. So we can start talking about these issues on the surface. Walden Pond, many of you have probably been there. On a summer day, it's really nice and clear, and you can go out there and walk in the water or go swimming. But if you go a little deeper under the water, several feet, or dip your toes down, you'll find it's darker and colder, and there's silt at the bottom of the pond, and we could learn all kinds of things in the depths. So when we get into these issues, one of the expertise one kind of expertise we need in coping is the ability to move to different levels of the issue, because sometimes we get into really deep stuff with this work. The picture on the right actually is a place called Crawford Lake in Ontario, near Toronto. You might have heard about Crawford Lake in the news because people have been using it as a place to study the effects or evidence for this idea of the Anthropocene, this idea of this age of geological age where humans start to really transform the planet. And because of the specific um, geography and geology of Crawford Lake, you could go into the silt there and see measure records of all different past weather systems. You could see signals from when the first use of atomic bombs and things like that. So we can really go deep into this stuff. So that's one metaphor that might be useful. Another metaphor is what I call the climate elephant, and that's simply bringing in an old story that many of you are familiar with, or a parable of the blind men and the elephant, or the blind people and the elephant. And it's the idea that these people cannot see, but they come across this beautiful big creature, and somebody finds the tail, somebody finds the trunk, somebody finds one of the legs, someone finds the side, and they all see different parts of this large creature. And that's a great way to think about these big global issues like climate change, because we will have a part of the issue that we really see or that's really important to us, but it's impossible really to see the whole. We can strive for it, we can keep stepping back, but really, when you think about a global experience, it's hard for us to know what it's like for everyone and different people around the world. And so the elephant metaphor I find helpful in terms of our own identities and our own understandings, but also compassion for ourselves that we can't know everything, and awareness of blind spots, and the need to collaborate with other people to get the whole. And the elephant has all kinds of metaphors. When I use this with groups, they come up with all kinds of different metaphors to extend it. Like someone said, well, yeah, and someone's being stepped on by the elephant, right? That's an environmental justice issue. Or someone's being pooped on by the elephant, and that's a toxic issue. And someone's sitting on top of the elephant, really comfortable, and that's a privilege issue, right? So people take this metaphor in different directions. But I like to use it, and I've not spent a lot of time personally in Cape Ann, but I have a sense of your area, and so it's interesting to think about all the. This is a busy slide, and it's meant to kind of be hard to see because it's the elephant in a community. Like for example, in the Cape Ann area, when we think about an issue like climate change, there's going to be a tie-in from local industry and business, from the community, from different cultural groups, families, children, elders, businesses, the arts, government, land use, conservation, infrastructure, public works, right? Fire, police. Now that elephant might manifest in a weather disaster, for example, and all these different players are going to come into connection around the issue. So whatever aspect of the climate elephant that's most important at a moment, it's going to tie in all these directions. And you all that are in the audience and here today, you'll have different connections with different parts of the community here. Some of you might be in government, some of you might be doing disaster response or emergency preparedness, others land use conservation, others doing academics and research, spiritual, religious communities. Obviously, you all have your own families and your own children and elders, and of course, there's the natural environment and the indigenous presence and ethnic groups. So when I do some of these talks, if we were doing more of a public, gathering where we could chat at length, the question would be to the group, how are we doing? So how are we doing with the elephant? Are we communicating with each other? Are we seeing all the different sides? So it's an interesting sort of reflection question. So I'm not expecting that you have an answer for this, but it's just something to put on the table as we go. And as we think about environmental identity and people's beliefs and values, how are we doing on that elephant and kind of working together? So we'll see if these metaphors are helpful or not, but they're just ways to kind of get the conversation started in an interesting way. Because there's a lot of deeper, again, with the pond, we get deeper here. There's a lot of deeper creative tensions in the environmental work, sustainability work, and it leads into the intersection in my territory, which is therapy and counseling and personal growth, coping, stress management, right? So there's a tension between opening up issues and containing them, right? in our own life. Do I really want to open up to all these problems and challenges, or do I want to kind of keep them contained, right? There's no right or wrong answer here. We can't be 100% open all the time to every single thing going on in the world. That's overwhelming. So we do have to contain things in the middle of a disaster or something important. We do have to contain feelings in the short run just to cope and get through whatever the issue is, right? So this is a tension in general in this work and also in our own personal sustainability. You know, how much am I open to the pain of the world or the joy of the world, and how much do I need to contain things? And then there's the tension between learning and insight and taking action, right? We sometimes people are stressed and they have a compulsion toward taking action, and they might not take enough time to plan and really sit with a situation. On the far end of insight is meditation and just sitting and being present with things, being mindful without feeling the need to rush into action, right? But again, there's a wisdom piece there about what's needed at any given moment. There's in climate science and climate work the tension between adaptation and mitigation, right? Those are climate language, right? Are we mitigating climate problems by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and methane and various things, or doing carbon capture or some sort of thing like that, or are we working on adapting to the changed world? And to the world as it is. And that's, another creative tension. We have to do both. At any given time, we're going to be either adapting or hopefully or mitigating, but we can't sometimes do both at the same time. And then on a more perhaps political side or change agent from from the perspective of a change agent, are we working on adjusting to a system as it is, or are we trying to change the system? Are we liberating ourselves, right? And that's, again, no right or wrong answers there, but that's a tension that will come up. And so as we're thinking about the long haul of our coping, we're going to toggle between these things, and having insight about this is helpful. And having some language and having some tools is helpful. So keep tracking your questions. I know Maureen's gonna help with the Q&A. If you want to throw things in the chat, I might be able to see those as I go. But let's keep plunging ahead. If I wanted to simplify this talk just to one slide, I would say this is engaging with environmental issues in your life from a coping, psychological perspective. Is the first step is not action, but it's really self-assessment, and it's looking at your own environmental beliefs and values and what I call your environmental identity, which is the aspect of your personal identity that's related to your sense of relationship with nature and the natural world and other species, right? We all have different aspects of our identity. These days, people are coached to think about their cultural identities, their racial or ethnic identity, their gender identity, their sexual identity. And these are things that we learn to understand and talk about, and we express our identity, and we try to honor other people's identity. And environmental identity is just another kind of identity like that, although people often haven't been coached to talk about it. So it's a great tool for us, right? What is our environmental identity? And that can include positive things like our strengths and our abilities and our positive life experiences and sources of resilience and health. And it can include difficult things like losses and traumas and concerns and fears about environmental issues, right? So assessing that. And then how do we adapt what we already know, my existing skill set, my existing worldview, in the service of environmental sustainability or climate adaptation or mitigation? So how do I, rather than reinventing the wheel, how do I put into play what I'm good at already? So that's a kind of a theoretical question, and then the practical question is how do I actually apply that in the real world, either in my job, or my personal life, or things I'm studying? Because the application piece, as you know, is much more difficult. We can think of all kinds of things to do, but the application is when we really try to do a program of any kind. We realize it's often way more complicated than we think, and we run into barriers. And that's where we need to stick with something over time. And why it's nice to have that environmental identity piece is because that's where we can toggle back to after we've been working on a project for 6 months and we start to get tired and burn out and wonder why the heck we're doing it in the first place. We can go back to environmental identity and say, oh, I'm doing this because it's part of my values, it's part of who I am, right? And it helps us to reconnect and restore ourselves. So it is kind of a cycle, right? So anyway, we'll keep talking about that. A little bit about me. I won't talk a bit about me, but I did, as Maureen said, I grew up in Buffalo, New York, which is on the eastern shores of Lake Erie. I have a working class family. I'm the first person in my family to go to college, and the first person in my family to go to graduate school. I have Irish and Polish heritage. I went to college in New York City. Studied a little bit in Europe and Ireland when I was in college. And then after college, I promptly moved out to the West and have lived out on the West Coast ever since. So I'm kind of a West Coast person now. And I used to do a lot of work years ago before I became a psychologist doing outdoor work. I was an outdoor leader and a river rafting guide and did sort of outward bound kind of programs. And then I started getting into psychology and I ended up getting into a doctoral program to study psychology. And when I came out of my program, I started talking about environmental issues, and I had had that earlier interest from my wilderness therapy days. And I actually had a really great experience going to graduate school in Keene, New Hampshire, at Antioch, New England, where I know Maureen studied. And I did the psychology program, but I also used to moonlight and slide over to the environmental studies program and learn from them. So that's kind of my background because there wasn't any program to study what I do at that time. It didn't exist. There wasn't any eco-psychology program. So you had to make it up as you go. But since then, it's become, the world's kind of caught up to me now. I've been doing teaching and training here for a number of years. And so that's a little bit about me. I'm a solo parent of a 16-year-old daughter, and I live in Portland. Couple of things, resources. I do have this podcast. That's a great place to check in. I do this podcast with a colleague from Finland, actually, and we talk about climate change and all kinds of feelings and coping. And it's a provocative title, Climate Change and Happiness, but it's meant to beg the question about what does it mean to be happy in the modern world? So that's kind of a meta question that we're working on here. But we have tons of different episodes on different topics you might appreciate. Some ground rules. Again, I'm seeing this talk for you all as a way to step back and think about the feelings and emotions and some of the people side of this work, right? So when I'm talking to groups about environmental issues, I have some ground rules that I keep to myself. First, do no harm. So that means don't damage your audience, right? So that means, I don't typically start with a deadening amount of slides with all the different statistics about how bad things are in the world. There are bad things going on in the world, but people know that already. So we want to kind of be gentle with ourselves. We do want to take action, but we don't want to kind of hurt ourselves in the drive to take action. So yes, we want to help, but first we want to do no harm, and that includes to yourself, taking care of yourself. And recognizing that these are all ecological issues, right? There's a famous saying by John Muir, when you pick on one thing in the universe, you find a hitch to everything else, right? Classic ecology saying, and it's true. So whatever we talk about today, it's linked to all kinds of things. If we talk about sea level rise, we might quickly talk about your neighborhoods or your community or how people build or the laws around what people can do in terms of seafront access. It'll bring in economic issues, political issues, class issues, social justice issues, disaster preparedness issues. So something like sea level rise goes in many, many directions for people, or the health of the marine species or the right whales or things like that. And we want to honor emotions and stories. This is not just an intellectual thing for people. It's their deepest emotions and values are at play. And if you do public talks, sometimes people just need to tell their story, and you have to be prepared for that because they don't have an opportunity to talk about this often. And then there's that meaning piece about all the different diverse meanings. That's why I like that elephant image, because it gives us this visual about all the different ways that people might think about this. And it helps to avoid some of the common communication issues that'll come up. Another variation of the elephant, as I call it, is the Babel problem, or the Tower of Babel problem, where everybody's talking about the same issue and they're all using different words and language, and they have a hard time communicating, right? And then a basic point that all environmental issues are justice problems all around the world, whether it's Portland or Gloucester or Boston or whatever. The people that have least power and privilege are the ones that are going to bear the brunt of environmental issues. So we always have to keep that in mind. And no matter how bad we have it, somebody has it worse. So it's always relative in terms of privilege and risk. So these are some ground rules to keep in mind. Um, People often ask me, what does ecotherapy look like? You do this kind of climate therapy. Like they might have a sense of counseling or therapy, but um, what does it look like? So I'm gonna give you a little flavor of this, and it's all this is things that you can do on your own personal ecotherapy that you do to yourself in terms of your self-care or when you're working with someone. So just to give you a flavor, it's not that complicated really, but it is interesting to think about. Um, I'm going to use some case studies too that are helpful. These are composite case studies. They're not exactly real people, but they're based on people that I've worked with. So it's always nice to hear human stories. And one of a classic case is a teen adolescent. This character Agnes, and she would stand in for the very intelligent, precocious teen that's a climate activist that's really taking action, really knows a lot about climate science, relatively for a 17-year-old, maybe working in some group like the Sunrise Movement, um, and she's cynical, doesn't trust adults, thinks the adults are abandoning young people and things like that. So when I would meet with her, she would say like, my previous therapist didn't know what a Keeling curve was, right? Which is of course this famous chart that tracks CO2 in the atmosphere. But the point being is that she feels like some people don't get it. They don't get climate change and why it's a concern. And she would use words like youth washing, right, where organizations bring up a youth to speak to kind of as a figurehead because they want to look progressive, but they're not really making changes, right? Or she her group met with the governor of Oregon, and they were excited to share their policy proposals, but they felt the governor took most of the meeting up just blabbering on about the governor's policies and how successful she was, and didn't really want to hear what the kids had to say. So they felt that they were being gov-splained, she said. So I would say with Agnes, we'll make a deal with me, Agnes. I understand all this stuff, but let's just see if we can't do some things to make you and feel better and be better as an activist, right? So what would some of that look like? Well, well, there's the Keeling curve. I know you all know about this, but a lot of people don't, so I'll often remind them what this is. Um, but when I'm working with someone like Agnes, one of my catchphrase to myself is validate, elevate, and create. That's my little saying. And you could use that for yourself. So that means I validate their concerns. I take them seriously. A lot of people are used to their environmental concerns being, either belittled or dismissed or not taken very seriously. And then I go farther. I elevate them. Like pick them up and say, let's look at this issue from all different sides, and let's really make this important. Your feelings and thoughts about nature, the environment, climate change, plastics in the ocean. This is important stuff. It really affects your life, and it's really basic to your sense of well-being. And that's really helpful for people. And then even beyond that, let's get creative about this. And that's a really key step, is that creativity. So that means we're not going to shut this down. We're not going to automatically solve it. Let's just get creative about this. What do you know about this? Where does it come from? What does it mean to you? And then I have other phrases like, it might be validate, elevate, and educate. Maybe a person brings in a concern and I happen to know a bit about that, and I'll educate them about that. Or maybe we'll delegate and say, well, we need to get some more information. You have a very interesting question. I'm not sure of the answer. Let's figure it out together. Or moderate, hey, maybe you're getting a little worked up about this. Maybe we have a little more time than you think. Maybe, I know you're concerned about the state of the planet, but, I think looks okay today. I think we have some time to work on these things. Can we agree to kind of calm down a little bit so we can take some time and get to know this better and take care of ourselves? Or even validate, elevate, and meditate. Let's just sit with this. This is a big issue. If someone's dealing with some big existential issue about mortality, grandparents concerned or an elder's concerned about their legacy, or they're worried that their children don't want to have children, so they'll never have grandchildren. Some of these deep issues that come up, well, sometimes we just have to sit with those and kind of see what's going to happen. We don't have answers for these things. So there's a whole existential level here, right? And some other basics. Um, you don't have to solve a problem in order to cope with it. This is really helpful for people to hear, because sometimes they think, well, since we can't solve issues like climate change or plastics, there's no way for me to cope. That's not true, right? You don't have to solve the problem, cope, but we can engage with the problem, but we can still take care of ourselves, right? For forever, humans have worked on difficult issues. People have worked on issues of poverty or injustice or war or famine. We don't necessarily have to solve these things in order to take action on them in order to cope in the present day. So this can be really helpful and liberating for people. It gets them out of a black and white way of thinking about things. And then we hurt where we care is another good reminder. We have concerns about the natural environment or climate change or any of these issues because they touch on our values, on things that we care about. So the hurt is a signal that we have a value and something is important. And if we can touch in with that value, the values become our center, our kind of anchor, and that allows us to take action. So otherwise, people get lost in the hurt, and they don't have a ground to put their feet on the ground. So these are some things I might work with a young person that are helpful. I mean, for people of all ages. Um, and then having a growth mindset. You might be familiar with this concept from education, but it's the idea that a fixed mindset would hold that I'm good at some things, I'm bad at others, and I have innate abilities, and I'm kind of fixed in that way. And a growth mindset says that for almost any ability, it's really a matter of spending time learning and practicing. People might have some innate qualities, but for the most part, anyone successful in almost any endeavor is really because they've spent a lot of time working on it. And so giving people this idea, we can have a growth mindset about coping with climate change or the environment. Most people have a fixed mindset about environmental issues. They say, this is the way society is, this is the way evolution is, this is the way humans are, this is the way politics are, and we're stuck. And that's not a healthy way to approach things. Again, it doesn't mean there's not problems and barriers, but having a growth mindset allows us to imagine that things can be changed. I can change, the system can be changed. So it's a nice thing to work on and catch yourself, like I have to catch myself when I'm lapsing into a fixed mindset about things. All right. Another case study would be someone a little bit older, into their 20s or maybe even early 30s. This is based on a person that's a veterinary student that's studying PFAS chemicals in the environment, in this case in the Great Lakes. So, and that's another group of people, along with adolescents, that are at high risk for environmental distress, is professionals of all kinds that work on environmental issues. Could be a conservation professional or a scientist or a public health person, right? And they carry a lot of knowledge that's really troubling, and that even the public might not fully understand. And the PFAS issue and chemicals is a big issue in different parts of the world. And then they're a human, so they're guilty about their own personal impacts. And if they're really high functioning and successful, like a graduate student in veterinary science, they're probably pretty perfectionistic and they probably have super high standards. So they're really likely to beat up on themselves because they're not feeling good enough, right? So that good enough thing comes in here. And then that leads to mood issues and sleep problems. So again, it comes back to this idea of personal sustainability. How do we take care of ourselves. This particular young person was also having thoughts about whether they want to have children or not, and they know they're what they call their big fat Greek family in Chicago is very big, very family oriented, and so it would be an expectation everybody would have children and grandchildren and great grandchildren, and she's really not sure about that based on her work. So that would lead into sort of whole family therapy dimension with these issues. So, this is a more deeper kind of level two therapy idea. Um, but this is saying that we have issues and we have issues, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that we have capital I issues, things that we want to work on in the world, like plastics in the ocean, or like sea level rise, or like social justice, or whatever big issue that's important to you. That's your capital I issue. It might be something closer to home, like planting your garden, or parenting your family, or running your business, right? And the lowercase I issue is our stuff. That's our personal issues. That's our baggage. That's our history, our imposter syndrome, our shyness, our neuroses, our fears. There could be, actual trauma and loss. It's all our idiosyncrasies and things like that. Um, and these capital I and lowercase I issues are often related. Obviously, if someone had a bad experience in the past, a disaster, a loss, they might then adopt that as a capital I issue they want to work on and help to prevent for other people. That's a classic pathway. And I can take the healthiest person. You might be like one of you might be the healthiest, most well-adjusted person in Massachusetts, and I'll put you to work for 6 months to 2 years on a really intractable government, ecological, political issue. And I can guarantee you're going to develop some lowercase I issues. You're going to be tired. You're going to be fatigued. You're going to be burned out. You're going to be cynical. You're going to have work-life balance issues, right? So we, in ecotherapy, we're trying to hold these important things that people are working on and the personal stuff and kind of working with those together. Because I want people to take action on those big I issues. I want them to be good citizens and change agents. But, it makes no sense to run yourself down in service of saving the world, because we are a part of the world. We are part of nature. So that brings us back to this idea of personal sustainability. There's no easy answers for this, but each of us has a story about this. And these are all just language and tools and concepts that we can start to use. Um, Another character, a Roman, he stands in for the scientist. This person had an experience of actually spending time in Antarctica and spending time studying the Thwaites Glacier and some of the Doomsday Glacier that people are concerned about collapsing and really leading to catastrophic sea level rise that would show up in at some point in New England. And um, issue not being sure what to do with his life. Should I even continue? Is it worth doing science? Feeling out of place when he comes back home, and of course having his own issues around whether he should get married, whether he should have kids, et cetera, et cetera. So it stands in for some of the meaning, the deeper meaning issues that can happen. And for someone like that, it's really about how to feel, how to work on climate emotions. So I'm going to talk about feelings, and then I'm going to bump ahead to eco-anxiety and grief and some of those difficult ones. I might skip ahead of some slides here, but just to give you a heads up. But with someone like Roman, and you can think about this too, how am I managing my feelings about these issues? Think about what emotional intelligence would be in this regard. What is emotional intelligence in the sense of climate and environmental coping? Um, you know, Part of it is literally having a vocabulary of feelings, right? Because if we only have a limited vocabulary, I'm either scared, or I'm either happy or sad, or I'm in dread, or I'm in denial. We don't really have a good repertoire. So I'll often use this is just a little uh, section of a feelings list here, just to give you an example of what might be on a full feelings list. But there's all kinds of feelings words. So I might feel burned out. I might feel cranky. I might feel depleted. I might feel edgy. I might feel exhausted, frazzled, mobilized, overwhelmed. Those are all sort of in the fatigue anxiety territory, but they mean slightly different things. So getting clear on the feelings that we're having, right? It's one thing to feel depleted, and you will feel depleted after a hard day of work or weary, and that's normal and even healthy to be weary. It means you've just put in a good day. But feeling exhausted or burned out, that's a little more deeper. So, can we use accurate feeling? Sometimes people overuse the term burned out. They're not actually burned out, they're just tired and they're weary and they need to get some rest, right? So, these feelings, the feelings work can get us more precise, right? And we can find different kinds of feelings. And so the way I work with feelings is three levels, three questions you can ask yourself. First one is basic question, like what do I feel? That's the expressive question, and that requires some thinking. Like, what do I feel? Okay, and then using more elaborate vocabulary, because we feel so many different things. The goal is having 360 feelings, is what I say, so we can feel. If I see something beautiful, I feel uplifted. If I feel something depressing, I feel sad. If I feel something surprising, I feel surprised or I feel positive, right? So we want to be able to feel 360. Another more radical question is, what do I want to feel? What do I want to feel about climate change? What do I want to feel about plastics in the ocean? Do I want to, well, people say, I don't know what I want. If I could, I'd feel maybe happy or satisfied or courageous or confident. Okay, so that's what we're going toward. Like, what would it take you to feel that way? Because we have felt these things and it is possible to feel these things. So once you give permission, we can work on trying to cultivate those feelings. And you can start with more middle ground feelings, like just, I might not feel confident or excited, but I could feel present, curious, open, aware, right? So we can kind of sneak up on these positive feelings, and that's emotional regulation, right? And then a deeper question is, what should I feel? Like, what does the universe want me to feel? What is healthy for me? What is growthful for me to feel at any given moment? Sometimes if we're dealing with something that's sad or we're dealing with a loss, then that's where we need to be. We need to be in those feelings for a while, right? But sometimes if we're stuck cycling around those, we need to break out and cultivate some different kinds of feelings, right? So that's more of a personal wisdom question. Hope comes up. Hope is words like hope and faith are really neat to explore. Hope, a lot of people think of hope is really more of a verb. Like to hope means to, like my personal definition of hope is in one's highest vision of the possible, right? So it begs the question about what's possible, and then what's my highest vision in relation to that, right? And then I focus on that, so that would be like a evidence-based hope or an active hope, right? So there's different ways to kind of play around with emotions, but it could be really liberating for people. So that's that. Um, and I am going to skip over, and I might come back to this stuff, but I want to get to eco-anxiety because we said on the poster we would talk about eco-anxiety. So we're going to do that for a few minutes. Um, but we're not going to lose 360 feelings and realize this is just one part of the feeling spectrum, but it's an important one to have some competence around. So just some background. Eco-anxiety, I've studied this a fair bit. Eco-anxiety is not a scientific term. It came out of pop culture. I first have seen it. The first place I've seen it used was in a news story in 2007. Um, Specifically, this modern eco-anxiety. People have talked about anxiety in relation to like chemicals or things for decades, for years. I mean, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in the early 60s, and that was a variation on eco-anxiety and concerns about DDT in the environment. But this modern formulation of eco-anxiety, it kind of came around in the early aughts. It was first used in relation to toxic chemicals, actually, and it was used in relation to people's concerns about endocrine disrupting chemicals in the environment that were causing fertility issues, right? So that's a good cue. Eco-anxiety is often used now in relation to climate change, but it isn't just about climate change. It's really exactly what it sounds like. It's anxiety about ecological issues, right? Ecological systemic issues. That's why it's so kind of insidious because we come from all this different directions, right? Um, and when you're looking at climate impacts, this is a slide about from my research on climate change. But there's three basic boxes of climate impacts: disaster impacts, the broad societal impacts like refugees and economic impacts and things like that, and then indirect emotional impacts of watching climate change unfold from a distance, right? And eco anxiety kind of lives in that indirect, emotional, subjective part of this of the impact spectrum, right? Um, and eco anxiety is really interesting because it has both a physical and a social dimension. So one side of eco anxiety is social. So it'd be kind of to the right of this diagram. This is from one of my classes, but there's a social cultural level to eco anxiety. It's like, what does it mean to live in a society that has strange systems of politics and economics that creates all these problems? And it's a kind of it's a political topic. It's kind of it's a way of someone thinking about their environmental identity. When someone says I'm eco anxious or I have eco anxiety, what they're signaling is that they care about environmental issues, and environmental issues are part of their worldview. So eco anxiety is a bit of a self label, and it's you know polarized and pulled into politics and all kinds of things. But on the other side, it's a physical, real, practical thing, and that would be represented in questions like, well, Dr. Doherty, is eco anxiety a mental health disorder or not? That's a practical question, and it's yes and no. It doesn't have to be. Anxiety is a normal feeling. So just to be anxious is not any kind of disorder. But certain people can be so overwhelmed with anxiety or depression or other hard feelings that it can become a diagnosable problem. So that that side of eco anxiety is captured in our self care or in personal stories that people say of how they're coping, or thinking about it from a public health perspective. Um, and then some people really want to amplify eco anxiety and talk about it because they have a sense of crisis and it validates their concerns. And they also, from an environmental movement standpoint, think it might help to push the public if we really get into this anxiety. But as you know, too much anxiety just leads to paralysis. So that's a more practical environmental messaging kind of question. And then a lot of people don't like this. Some coming from just basic crude denial, making fun of liberal progressives because they're concerned about the climate or denying this as alarmism. But even people that are environmental or people that are taking action are skeptical sometimes because they don't want their healthy feelings, um, diagnosed, turned into some sort of diagnosis, right? So it's a challenging little piece here. Um, but you can understand how this works, like, and how we talk to ourselves. The way these kinds of things work in society, there's a bit of a downward spiral that can happen. We've got all this fossil fuel propaganda. So we've got, denial and confusion about climate change, stifling of government action. There's these different sort of myths out there that fossil fuels have to be used and that climate is a personal problem caused by people's personal lifestyle. All right, so we got all the politics and the propaganda and all that stuff that's really causing gridlock. And then we've got all the stressors in the media, people seeing these garish stories of disasters and things like that, particularly people that are really deeply into the media and doom scrolling. And then that interacts with their own thinking. Society's doomed. I'm not doing enough. I'm a bad person, right? And then it's easy to get down into a spiral. And then, of course, that plays into the whole individual myth that this is our problem. And then I read more news and I feel bad. So we got to be careful about that. We want to kind of liberate ourselves from this, partly by understanding how that propaganda works. And this is not a personal problem. You know, we don't create fossil fuel government policies or fuel standards for cars or subsidies for green energy. These are all political things, right? They're not personal problems only. And we have to understand the structural part of this. And we have to take care of ourselves so we're not just engrossed in negative messaging and doom scrolling. And we have to be able to tell ourselves that we are enough. We're not bad people and we are taking action. So we can start to move toward a positive spiral. Um, but it is easy for people to get stuck in feeling like a climate hostage, like I'm stuck in the system. That's part of what we want to validate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about grief, and then we're going to open it up to questions because I think I've given you enough concepts that we can have a rich discussion here. But I want to just touch on the grief piece um, because it is an important thing to own and be aware of. So climate or environmental grief could be any number of feelings about either the past, current, or future losses. So it's really interesting. Climate change is a special animal because so much of it is future oriented, where you have all this, we have all this information that how we think and know are going to happen is going to happen. And so grief can be personal, it can be symbolic, right? One thing that I've found helpful when I'm working with people is to have them create what I call a grief map. And you might find this helpful to think about next time you're down in the low mood about this. So I can be grieving past losses, like a species that has long been extinct, or a people or a place that's not here anymore. And and the action there is about memorializing those losses and living in the spirit of and drawing value from these losses to act in the present moment. And then, of course, we have all the present losses we're living with, which includes all the climate threats and rapid changes in the environment and extinctions that may be happening, during our lifetime. Um, some people, adopt more of like a hospice or end of life attitude around this. I need to be present for some of these losses. And it also leads to these feelings of sadness and dislocation and what they call solastalgia, kind of, grief for something that's passing right around you in the present. And then we have future losses. These are things that we're anticipating we're going to lose in the future. Um, could be literally land will lose to sea level rise or species or our own lifestyles. This is what they call in psychology a lost possible self. It's a self that we imagine we're going to have, and we have to let go of it. And you've all had experiences of lost possible self. You might have been in a job that you liked, and then you had to leave the job, or a home that you liked, you had to move, or a relationship didn't develop the way you thought it would be, and you had to let go of this vision that you had for your life and recreate a new vision. So this is some of the depth work here of coping. And people do different things. Um, we say grief is a feeling, mourning is an action. So the we understand the feelings, but then we take action in honor of those feelings. This picture is an interesting one. It was from Paradise, California, after the big campfire, and a bunch of the emergency room nurses who were working that day in that horrific time. They all got tattoos to memorialize the fire, and I think that's a really concrete example of how people need to mark these events and live in honor of them, right? So it's really interesting work that we're doing here. Um, but I bring it back to place in this work when I'm needing my own grounding. Where do I live? What's important to me? Getting outside, getting in the air, getting away from my screen. So I want to encourage you at some point to kind of come back to your place because that's the point of this is our connections with nature and the natural world. And the place itself might be damaged, but that's okay. It's still part of us. So we want to, if we had more time, we'd get into self-care and various things, but this is just a little bit of a flavor. So I'm going to stop my slides for right now and just open it up. I might pull my slides back up if we have a neat thing to refer to, but I think we've covered some interesting ground to get us going. So I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to turn this back to Maureen, and just kind of see where we're feeling right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Doherty, for that overview. And definitely is making me think about certain things that have happened in my climate hostage.
Hmm.
But I just a note about using the chat. If you have a question for Dr. Doherty, please put it in the chat. You can also raise your hand and I will call on you. Raising your hand allows me to see you in the group. And Tom Meekis, maybe you could put us on the gallery view. That also might be helpful. Anybody have a question for Dr. Doherty? I think you might be able to unmute yourself as well. Um, Dr. Doherty, I kind of want to go back to the elephant in the room.
Hmm.
But like this climate elephant, what's a way, like a practical way that you can talk about some of these things, and put like understanding all of the different parts into action. Like how can we, when we're talking to someone or when we're thinking about it, what do you
Yeah.
what do you think is a good place to start?
Yeah. Well, I like images like the elephant or the pond because it gives people like a something like a map to work with a little bit and help they can situate themselves. So I really feel like it's helpful to give people a place to start. Um, and someone just put up on the chat about intersectionality and race and ethnicity. But the elephant is a way to start bringing those concepts in, and normalize the differences. And so that's why when I'm beginning a talk, I like to throw out some of those metaphors, and then we can play with them later because it is easy just to lose ourselves. And Practically, if a way to work with the elephant also is to bring back that idea of environmental identity. Like I have my own identity. So I kind of pride myself on being able to talk to almost any group about this. And I don't really care about their politics because I'll just say, you have your environmental identity and you could be a rancher, you could be a fisherman, you could be a steel worker, you could be a scientist. And and people will tell me about their environmental identity. Once you give them permission, they'll go on about it. And so that helps to normalize. And then you have your piece, part of the elephant. When I'm working with a group that's actually trying to make change, then there's interesting ways to play with that metaphor. Because if I'm pulling on the tail and someone's pulling on the trunk, the elephant's not going anywhere, right? We're kind of so when we cannot work together, we actually we kind of work against each other. So sometimes we say, we can't necessarily, and you can't push an elephant either. Um, but if I can get two legs to work together and the back end, I can get some movement. So can we find alliances that we can work together to get this creature moving? So that's a way that I start to bring in community collaborations because practically the only way we're going to make action on climate change in any scalable way is a lot of different kind of people working together, and that means environmentalists working together, which is actually harder than you might think. I mean, some of you might understand, but like environmentalists are actually, they pride themselves on being, flexible and, but they're not. A lot of environmentalists are very focused on very specific things and they don't sometimes work together very well. That's a secret. That's a dark secret of this. So, we need to work together, even with people that we don't get along with very well, or I'm a science type and I want to work on data and technology. Someone else is a spiritual type and they want to talk about myth and poetry, and someone else is a social action type that wants to talk about intersectionality and social stuff. And all those people have to work together, and that's like different parts of the elephant. So easier said than done, but hopefully
Yeah,
that gets you
I,
going in
I
that direction.
I'd like some, coaching on ways to bring people together like that. But we do have a question from Sam. Can you comment on Joanna Macy's idea of building a practice of building hope, even when you don't feel hopeful?
Yeah, Joanna Macy is a in environmental circles of a certain environmental. So she's a very well known kind of environmental teacher and also kind of a spiritual teacher. And she's associated with grassroots environmental empowerment for many, many years. So if you're not familiar with her work, it's a good, she's a good person to look into. I did years ago, I did a workshop with Joanne, one of her workshops with Joanne Reese herself, and it was really, really helpful for me at that time in my career to understand my what I call now my own environmental identity. And yeah, that she talks about active hope and you know those kind of programs. They're not academic and they're not scientific, but they are meant for people to they're what I consider a despair and empowerment approach in the sense that it really helps people go deep into their darker feelings and really express those in a supportive group environment, which can be really lightening and liberating. So that's how that can be helpful. I mean, there's broadly two emotional styles in this work. There's the despair and empowerment, where we really need to go into the dark side and build capacity to sit with these dark feelings and draw power and inspiration from them. And then there's the positive broaden and build approach, where I say I want to talk about creativity, in future possibilities, positive, exciting scientific discoveries, and it uses positive emotionality to build. And what I find is that certain people gravitate to one or the other personally, and that's what they tend to try to do. But we need both. And ideally, we're going to use both of those perspectives. Sometimes we need to sit with the dark. Other time, I want to do that validate, elevate, create. And we're going to need both. But it's good to know your style and also be able to work on different styles because it's not ultimately what you need, it's what the other person needs. So if we're going to work with groups, we need to be able to give people what they need, not only what works for us.
Another question from the group: can online workshops be effective, or do they need to be in person?
Well, what do you all think? We're online right now, and I think this is not too bad. It's they're both. Um, it's a trade-off. It's amazing to me as a therapist and practicing therapist. The entire therapy world went on to Zoom within 2 weeks during COVID. The whole field's pivoted, and people have never looked back. And actually it's worked pretty well. But there are really some nice things about being in person too. So it's a both and. I'm actually involved with the American Psychological Association and trying to get them to be more sustainable and deal with this heavy footprint of their conference. And a lot of people are really invested in the conference, but it means all the flying and all the impact. And there's a lot of good research that shows that Zoom and hybrid or virtual gatherings bring in more people. They actually bring in a lot of younger, diverse, and people with lower income into these groups. So Zoom is not my favorite, platform in the world by any stretch, but it's incredibly democratizing of things. So there's both and. So I think we want to try to do both and. If we were all together, I would actually get us to stand up and move around and talk about some of these concepts, and we maybe like play around with the elephant and draw and whiteboards and stuff. So there's like nice things you can do in person. So it really blossom where you're planted. If you can do in person, fine, but make use of the online as well.
Another note from Pamela: the intersectionality was not answered. Question was not answered. Many low-income people have the greatest risk and trauma during floods and wildfires. And her question was, can you talk about the intersectionality of race, class, ethnicity at high-risk variables in cities regarding climate change?
Yeah, for sure. That's why I always make that point early on in a talk that all environmental issues are justice issues. Because as a white male who is relatively privileged in society, it's important for me to talk about that. Because if I don't say it, someone's going to say it, in the audience, and I don't know what people are dealing with. But yeah, intersectionality comes in play in a couple places. Our environmental identity is intersectional. So my identity in relation to nature and the natural world intersects with my gender identity, my cultural identity. Even in the same family, for example, that grow up in the same place, similar social class, the if it's highly gendered family, the males in the family and the females might do different things in relation to nature, right? You might have the classic, gendered New England family where the males go hunting and do this other stuff, and the females are supposed to be home and baking pies and stuff like that, or these various gender expectations. Uh, so that's one aspect of it. Color of our skin, whether we can go to a national park or feel comfortable. There's so many levels, and that's where we have to be able to talk because we can be blind to these things, um, and we also don't want to assume that someone of low income doesn't have an environmental identity or doesn't have environmental values, right? So, but also their version of environmental values might look different. I might be working on a land trust trying to conserve some seafront property or an oyster bed or something like that. Another person's environmental identity is about bringing air conditioning into inner city neighborhoods where people are dying from heat exhaustion during a heat wave, right? That's an environmental value just as well as, dealing with the right whales, so it really depends. So I'm not sure what else to say about that, but there's a mechanism psychologically and physically why that intersectionally matters as a public health issue, and it just needs to be part of it. I mean, the most interesting part of the environmental movement right now is the intersectional social justice part.
Mhm.
That's the newest edge that we need to be kind of thinking about.
Yeah, that's right. Um, well, before we close the webinar, I just wanted to let everybody know that we are going to have a field trip that is happening on May 4th. It's Saturday, May 4th. And folks are going to be receiving, who registered for this webinar, are going to receive a special code. We're doing this nature walk in collaboration with Cape Ann Trail Stewards. It's going to be Saturday, May 4th, starting at 10:30 a.m. It's on a greenbelt property called Annisquam Woods. You go down Revere Street and you go down Hutchins Court, and there you will travel all the way down to the parking lot. Catherine Prum will be our guide, and Catherine is the founder of Dharma Transitions. She's a death doula and a transition coach, and she works with individuals to support uh, and supporting communities to navigate grief and strategic challenges with the goal of creating meaningful, conscious, and purposeful lives.
Hmm.
Um, well, I just got a note from Amy. It's actually going to start at 10 a.m. Sorry about that. But we will be sending out this code to everyone so that they can have first dibs at what are incredibly popular walks in the woods. And then we'll be guiding. We'll be doing a nature walk, kind of in the spirit of what Dr. Doherty talked about today. We will be stopping and having some meditation, some thoughtful walking, and I hope that you will all join us for that. Dr. Doherty, thank you so much for joining us from all the way from Portland, Oregon this evening for this webinar on personal sustainability and action and your conversation about climate grief and anxiety and eco-anxiety. We really appreciate it so much. Thank you, and I hope
Thank
we'll see
you.
you
Thank you
again.
very much, everyone. Mhm. I hope to
Good
see you
night.
again and visit in person if I can make it out to the East Coast sometime.
Yeah, please come out and we'll do one in person.
Mhm.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening.